If you search microneedling for hair regrowth on YouTube, you will hear the same advice everywhere. Use 1.5 millimeters, go deep. More depth means better hair growth. Sounds logical. More depth equals more stimulation equals more hair. But here's the strange thing. The newest research says the opposite. In fact, shallower needles might actually work better. And today I want to show you why. Because in the last 2 years, we finally got real clinical data on microneedling depth, including a 2024 meta-analysis of 8 randomized control trials. And what it found challenges something a lot of people in this community have believed for years. Every week, someone asks me this: Al, what needle size should I actually use? 0.5 millimeters, 1 millimeter, 1.5 millimeters? And honestly, for a long time, we didn't really know. People were just copying what others did. Someone on a forum said 1.5 millimeters worked for them. Someone else copied it. Then someone else copied that. And eventually it became common knowledge. But that is not the same as scientific evidence. Now we finally have studies that looked at this question properly, and the results are very interesting. But before we talk about needle depth, we should answer a bigger question. Does microneedling even work? Because if microneedling doesn't work, needle size wouldn't matter at all. Here's one number I want you to remember. When researchers compared Minoxidil alone with Minoxidil plus microneedling, the microneedling group grew about 60 more hairs per square centimeter. That's not a small difference. That's a big improvement. And that's why microneedling has become one of the most popular tools in the hair loss community. But then the question becomes obvious. If microneedling works, how deep should the needles go? Most scalp microneedling protocols happen between 0.5 millimeters to 1.5 millimeters. Below 0.5 millimeters, the needles may not reach deep enough to trigger a strong response. Above 1.5 millimeters, you increase the chance of irritation and unnecessary trauma to the scalp. So the real conversation happens inside that window. Somewhere in there is the sweet spot. And this is where the new research becomes interesting. For years, many people believed something very simple. Deeper needles must work better. It feels logical. More depth equals more injury equals more stimulation. But when researchers actually looked at the data, the results surprised them. In 2024, scientists analyzed 8 randomized controlled trials involving 472 patients. This is the most complete analysis we have so far on microneedling for hair regrowth. And they compared results from different needle depths. Here is what they found. Needles under 1 millimeter had an effect size of 1.16. Needles over 1 millimeter had an effect size of 0.52. In simple terms, the smaller needles produced almost twice the regrowth effect. That surprised a lot of people, including myself, but it wasn't the only study pointing in that direction. A randomized control trial from Isfahan University compared 2 groups. One group used 0.6 millimeter needles and the other group used 1.2 millimeter needles. Both groups were also on Minoxidil. After 12 weeks, both groups improved, but the 0.6 millimeter group showed better results. They had higher hair count, thicker hair shafts, and less pain during the treatment. So now we have multiple studies pointing toward the same idea. Smaller needles may work at least as well and sometimes better than deeper ones. But why would that happen? To understand that, we need to look at what microneedling actually does. When you microneedle your scalp, you create tiny controlled injuries in the skin. Your body responds by starting a healing process. During this process, your body releases growth signals. These signals help activate weak hair follicles. One of the most important structures involved in hair growth is called the dermal papilla. This tiny structure sits near the base of the follicle and controls whether the hair grows. In most scalps, the dermal papilla sits roughly around 0.6 to 1 millimeter below the skin's surface. So when you needle around 0.6 to 0.7 millimeters, you are hitting the exact zone where these signals matter the most. You stimulate the follicle and trigger the healing response, but you avoid unnecessary damage. If you go deeper, you may simply create more injury without extra benefit. And that's one of the reasons why deeper needles don't always outperform shallower ones. But there's another factor most people don't think about, and that's the tool you are using. Most beginners start with a dermaroller. It is cheap and simple, but rollers have a hidden problem. When you roll them across your scalp, the needles don't enter straight, they enter at an angle. So the actual depth can be very different from what the box says. A roller labeled 1.5 millimeters might not actually reach that depth. And with longer needles, the rolling motion can sometimes pull the existing hairs, which is obviously not ideal when you are trying to regrow hair. That is one of the reasons why many people eventually switch to a dermastamp. A dermastamp works differently. The needles move straight up and down, so the depth you set is much closer to the depth you actually get, and you can adjust it easily. 0.5, 0.75, 1.25 millimeters. You can dial in exactly what you want. This is why I personally use the Follicly Derma stamp for my own routine. If you want to check it out, the link is in the description. Now let's look at some real examples. Different people, different routines, different depths, but they show what consistent microneedling can do. One user, for example, used 0.5 millimeter needles twice per week with a nightly minoxidil routine. After 3 months, the improvement is clear. The hair looks thicker and the hairline filled in slightly. And this shows something important. You don't always need deep needles to see results. Another user was 43 years old. He had crown thinning for over a decade. He used 0.75 millimeter needles every 2 weeks with topical minoxidil and finasteride. After just 3 months, the crown density improved noticeably. So age alone doesn't stop progress. Consistency matters more. Another user started with a 1.5 millimeter dermaroller, but he noticed something frustrating. The roller kept pulling his hair, so he switched to a 1.25 millimeter dermastamp. After a year, his crown filled in and his temples improved. Sometimes the tool makes a big difference. One more example. This user started microneedling at 1.5 millimeters once per week, but after a while he noticed heavy bleeding. So he reduced the depth to 1 millimeter and the progress continued. That is a useful lesson. Your scalp often tells you what it can handle. So if you ask me today, Al, what needle size should I use? Here's how I would approach it. If you are a complete beginner, start with 0.5 millimeter needles twice per week. It's simple, safe, and supported by research. If you already have some experience, try 0.75 millimeters once every 1 to 2 weeks. This depth sits right in the zone where many studies show strong results. If you want to go deeper, you can try 1 millimeter to 1.25 millimeters, but reduce the frequency. About every 10 to 14 days is usually enough. And if you see a lot of bleeding or irritation, that's a sign to dial it back, because the bigger factor in hair regrowth isn't needle depth, it's consistency. Every study shows the same thing. People who keep doing it week after week got the best results. If you are microneedling right now, tell me in the comments what depth you are using and how long you've been doing it. I try to read every comment. If you want to see my step-by-step microneedling tutorial, I will link it below. Until next time, I wish you a happy hair journey.